Of course, in so many ways, English language teaching is the opposite of tyranny. It's liberating. And I'm sure I'm not the only person in this room who found working in ELT, teaching English, working in International House in particular, a liberating experience. It was my first experience with the idea that for people to learn well, they should enjoy learning and they should engage with what they're doing. Learning was fun, and teaching was fun because learning was fun. It was an opportunity to try to be, and today and yesterday here at the conference, there's been so much evidence of this, to try to be what so many people in English language teaching are, which is creative, dynamic, enthusiastic, doing new things. There's a buzz. So why tyranny? Well, I stick to the word tyranny. I think, first of all, I've always felt fairly constrained by, and to some extent tyrannized, methodologically. I started teaching. Yesterday, Jeremy Harmer said that he did his teacher training course, his International House teacher training course in 1971. I started teaching in 1974, and like many people at that time, I started teaching with no training at all. And I did have a book. It was called The English We Use, and it had extracts of novels in it. And I went into all my classes, elementary, intermediate, advanced. I went in with the same material, and I did things with it. I was so pleased yesterday to discover that that's dog me. And of course my students learned, and of course they engaged. And yeah, then I did a teacher training course. I didn't do the CELTA course. I'd already been teaching for over a year. I did what is now a Delta course. And I did it with an International House teacher training experience. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful. I mean, it changed not only the way I teach, but the way I think and lots of things at all. And that, in a way, turned me into a particular kind of teacher. But once I was off the course, I, as the years went past, became more and more disobedient. I knew how I was supposed to teach, and because it's a long time ago, it wasn't one methodology. The methodology, of course, kept changing. So I had to learn a new methodology, and when I was being observed teaching by my director of studies, or when I was being observed by CELTA trainees, I would do, because I'm quite good at kind of this kind of thing, I would do the methodology I was meant to do. But I felt resistant to it. I didn't feel comfortable with it. And when there was nobody in the room, I did different things. Not much has changed in a way. I became a CELTA tutor, and that's when I really did feel constrained and uncomfortable. And I felt that I was promoting a methodology and a way of teaching that I actually didn't really believe in. So there's an element of tyranny there, and I was aware of it. I don't think I was aware of any sense in which there was a tyranny in relation to the language, and the title of my talk is The Tyranny of TEFLspeak. Despite the fact that I had an early, and I'm not really joking when I say fairly traumatizing experience. And it was only much later, and I'm going to talk about this later on in the talk, it was much later that I realized that this was an early example of my becoming aware of the tyranny of TEFLspeak. I suppose at this point I should say something about ELF, about ELF. And yesterday I thoroughly enjoyed the two sessions on ELF. And the title of my talk, The Tyranny of TEFLspeak, it suggests that perhaps I'm going to be advocating ELF. I find myself completely in sympathy with the ideology of ELF, and the things that Robin was saying yesterday, I feel absolutely fine about. I'm actually not talking about that, not because I don't agree with it, but because I hadn't been thinking of that when I planned the talk. I'm thinking really about British English, which is what I speak and what I teach, although that is changing, and with ELF that's changing. But I want to talk about British English and about the models of British English that we use. And before I go into that, I'm going to talk about the background and how my my gradual awakening to the fact that I was in some sense being tyrannized came about. First thing is I wrote a book, and Sean very kindly mentioned it. I wrote a grammar book which was published in 2000. It was fascinating just now being in Rachel's talk and Rachel talking about corpora and the use of corpora in writing books. When I wrote my first grammar book, I was very lucky. I used an early version of Can Code, which is the Cambridge and Nottingham corpus. And the book was corpus informed. So everything I put into the book, I checked against the corpus. And one of the things that became apparent was that an awful lot of the assumptions I made and I had acquired from using course books in a way seemed to be, and Rachel, those of you in Rachel's session, she gave us fantastic multiple examples of this, how there was a mismatch between the way language is used and the language that I had been teaching for many, many years. And one of the things I did to try and check this out was I wrote a list, and there are at least 2 people in this room who took part in this. I made a questionnaire, actually 3. I made a questionnaire with a number of examples, actually 4, a number of examples of English that were kind of dodgy. They were all examples of English that we don't find normally in the course books. But they were examples of English I had come across, many of them written, many of them spoken, all of them that I had come across more than once. Many of them had been brought into the classroom by learners. Something that I tend to do is to get learners to look for things and bring them in. And often they come in with examples of English they've found that contradict what they've been learning, what I've been teaching. So I had a long list of these, and I asked educated, competent users of English to classify them as correct, incorrect, or dubious. And if they classified them as dubious, to write something. Now, I had in the end 1,000, I wanted a kind of round number. I used 1,000. I had 1,000 of these questionnaires. Most of the people who took part, I should think about 90% of them, were people who speak English as their first language. But it wasn't necessarily the case. Loads of international house schools took part. I actually sent this to every international house school, and people got the staff in the school to do it and to send it back. It went out to lots of British Council centres, but it also went out to lots of people who are not English language teachers. So lots of the people who filled in the questionnaire were journalists, writers, teachers, but not of English. And I collated this, and I wanted to get an idea of what people thought about these examples. Now, it wasn't my intention at all to look at any difference between different groups who had done the questionnaire. But as I went through them, the thing which struck me was the difference between the answers of the English language teachers and the answers of the others. So my journalists, writers, lawyers, doctors were saying, yeah, it's fine, yes. And English language teachers were saying, oh no, we can't use, I mean, classic example, I've seen him yesterday. All English language teachers said, you can't say that because you're using an adverbial of past time with the present perfect. We don't do that. Whereas people who hadn't been through the process of being trained as a teacher and affected by the materials that we use, found this was fine. And there were loads of examples of this. Now, that's a little bit of background, and it started me thinking. The next bit of background is that I taught English as a foreign language for 25 years, 23 years in International House, and then I made a career change. In 1999, I obtained a job as a teacher in a comprehensive school, a very good comprehensive school, just on the northern border of London, on the border of London and Essex. And I started a new career, which is what I'd intended to do in the first place as a teacher of young people in London. I have to be careful, because as Jeremy was saying, but everybody was saying, but Jeremy in particular in particular in the panel discussion yesterday. In London, it's very difficult to say who's a native speaker and who's not a native speaker. Lots of people speak a different language at home or different languages at home. But it was an English school. And most of the people there, most of the pupils had parents who spoke English. It was, in a way, a very foolhardy thing for me to do. And I was aware of challenges. I thought that there would be a challenge in terms of the curriculum, with which I wasn't familiar at all, and I thought that there would be a challenge in terms of classroom management, and I wasn't used to teaching classes of 30 bolshy, unmotivated teenagers. And both of those were challenges, and they were both challenges which in the end I embraced, and actually now I really quite like classes of 30. Who was it asked? It's the person who asked the question from Oman here. Somebody asked a question yesterday. I was very interested in that. They were challenges, and I think I dealt with them. I didn't expect the third challenge, which was a linguistic challenge, because I have a degree in English. I even have a master's in teaching English. I thought my English was pretty good. And I discovered that I didn't understand my students. I mean, I think that was a bit the first problem. I remember very, very early in my time there, a girl came into my class, a girl called Gemma, 14 years old, sassy, you know, I don't do homework, that kind of girl. She came into my class late, and I said, why are you late? And she said, she didn't say it quite like this, she said, because I stacked it. I asked her to repeat it, and then everybody started laughing at me because I didn't understand what she was saying. I mean, that's an extreme example, and that's not something we would ever teach. I mean, we talked about ELF yesterday, and we talked about things like knackered and the inappropriateness. Nevertheless, I didn't understand my students, and I didn't understand the dialect they used. I didn't understand a huge number of words whose meaning has changed, and some of you are young enough to use them in the new way. So things like around, I'm not comfortable around animals, or random. I'm trying to use random now, as in some random teacher told me to. I realised I was out of date. I also realised there was a huge class issue, in a sense. But the problem was not just that I didn't understand my students, they didn't understand me. And not only did they very often not understand me, they understood my accent, but they didn't understand what I was saying. I had a huge problem of kind of how people perceived me, because they saw me as being pretentious and pompous and irrelevant to them and their needs. And so I had to learn to understand my students and some of my colleagues. But I'm not joking, but because I realized how narrow the way I talk is, how very specific it is. And I also had to understand them. So kind of first background to this talk was, I've forgotten already, but first background to this talk was writing the book and doing the questionnaire. The second one was my experience of discovering how limited in some ways the English I use is. Then I was very lucky that I was asked to do a second edition of my book. And I started working on that about 7 years ago, I think it was. And the corpora have improved hugely now. I use the same corpus as Rachel, because both books are published by Cambridge University Press. I use the fabulous Cambridge International Corpus. And the book was to be not corpus informed as the first book, but corpus driven. So I had to, and I say had to, it was wonderful to do that. I had to go to the corpus, and I had to actually find out how English is used, and then base the change, and then change what's in the book, and base that absolutely on the way that English is used. And those of you who, again, in Rachel's talk will see it's very surprising. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. Cambridge has two corpora. They have a corpus of native speakers and their English, and they have the learners' corpus. So Cambridge also have a corpus which is largely made up from Cambridge examinations, from PET and CAT and First Certificate, of learners speaking English, and there's information about their nationality and their first language and their level. So in order to look at the difficulties learners have with grammar, I could go to that and check out the learners. Now, the wonderful and curious thing that struck me right away was that I would go to the international corpus and native speakers and find examples and discover things like, oh yeah, that's much more common than that. And then I'd go to the learner corpus and I would discover that what I had found in the international corpus and native speaker corpus as being common or even the more common form was tagged in the learner corpus as being a mistake. So, I mean, things like none of us have and none of us has, which I think I snuck out at that point, but I think none of us have is more common than none of us has, at least in spoken or in written. But in the learner corpus, this was being considered as wrong, but native speakers were using it. So that was kind of the third thing that kind of made me feel awkward. Fourth thing was that in working on the book, I worked with a fabulous, brilliant editor who, as an editor should, challenged me on absolutely everything I wrote. And she was brilliant, but she was an EFL teacher, and and so she would simply say to me, you can't write that. And I'd say, but it's in the corpus, 80%, this is 80% of uses are this. And she'd say, no, but you can't write that because it's wrong. Why is it wrong, Helen? Well, because it's not in the course books. Now, in my book, and I can reassure you, and my publisher would kill you if I didn't, in my book I don't open up cans of worms. The aim of the book is to provide clear, accurate guidance to teachers, and it deals with English as we are used to teaching it. But it's a grammar book for teachers, not a grammar book for learners, and it does aim as well to get us teachers to explore the language and to look at some of the variety, geographical, social, and some of the changes, and some of the way that young people are using language, which perhaps people of my age don't. And I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to say kind of what decisions we made, but that's the background to my uncomfortable feeling that quite apart from colonialism, empire was mentioned yesterday, quite apart from some people feeling that it's wrong to propagate a model of English based on Britain or America, I'm arguing that even the model of British English that we propagate is one which in some ways is inaccurate, old-fashioned, quaint, and we need to reevaluate it. You have a handout with 21 sentences on it. I'm going to ask you to zip through it. All of them are from one corpus or the other. I want you to zip through it. I want you to mark correct, incorrect, or debatable. And when you've done that, to turn to somebody near you and to chat to them about it. This is where, if this really was a workshop and we then had kind of discussion of these, I would end up being very bruised, I think. I will give you an opportunity a bit later when you calm down to make comments or to ask questions. But I'm going to show you now, I'm not getting feedback, I'm going to show you how I've classified them. All of them, I think all of them, there are question marks of some kind over. But I only had, I classified them in this way, using those categories. Incorrect, instances that have always been or which have become general use, used by native speakers to make subtle distinctions, accepted in general use and arguably now standard, commonly used but considered uneducated, in common use among young people, standard English of the future in it. This is obviously subjective. Incorrect, too, in that there are no examples in the Cambridge International Corpus, the native speaker corpus, of use like this. Although perhaps very occasionally, as a slip, people might say these things, but these are non-native examples of English, and I think elf or not elf would probably correct them. The first one is so unimportant. I'll probably correct them. The first one is so unimportant that I wouldn't bother to correct it. But in fact, the fact that she died means that for that period before, the present perfect there we wouldn't use. And there aren't examples of it being used in that way. The second one also, the use of does as an auxiliary verb with living is a very common mistake for learners in, I think, all language groups, some language groups more than others. So I had those as incorrect. All right, gets more daunting. All right. Have always been or which have become general use. Frowned upon by some, warning about conservative examinations. So I'm not classifying these as wrong. I only had two that are incorrect. I might, in various teaching circumstances, say they were incorrect. If they contradict with what's in the course book, I might say it. If I'm teaching for FCE, where examiners are still kind of older than me even sometimes, and very conservative, then I wouldn't. But seems to me that these are fine. The corpus is fantastic. It's something like 99 examples of asking for permission in which use either may or can, use can. I mean, may just isn't used for it. Nobody's crucified me yet. All right, okay. Used by native speakers to me. Yeah, I think this is okay. Rachel had two examples of future perfect and how we use the future perfect for kind of sounding out things before we answer something. So, will you be wanting your car tonight? Will you be needing that? And she pointed out that, of course, the verbs we use with the future continuous are want and need, which we often teach as being group verbs that we use only in simple constructions and not continuous. But the last one, I'm visiting there every week. We use the present continuous in order to make the point that this is temporary. It's repeated, but it's temporary. It's not forever. I've seen him yesterday in spoken English is very common, in written English is quite common, the use of a one-word adverbial with the present perfect. Although English teachers think it's bad, because we tell elementary learners it's bad when we kind of simplify the rules. And why not? We simplify the rules for our learners. We simplify the rules for our learners. They need that simplification. We need not to kind of end up believing the things that we teach in order to simplify. And four, please tell me what I should do. It's about in the corpus. It's about, please tell me what should I do. It's 50-50 in the corpus, whether we make it indirect or whether it's direct. The amount of time. How much time have you spent teaching this? Who's ever succeeded in teaching it? I mean, quite apart from this, on the basis of ELF, it's one of those things. Chia yesterday showed us polite requests. It's one of those things that we can spend forever trying to teach, and people don't learn it, and they don't need it. And when people are interacting with other speakers of English as a foreign language, who cares? It's not there. But anyway, it's in the course books. It's one of those pages when I was disobedient that I used to skip over. Accepted in general use and arguably now standard. Warning about conservative examinations. It's only if you're doing an ELT examination you'd bother about this. This one, actually, I'm going to come back to, because after I did this, I discovered something very interesting, and that's the absolute last thing I'm going to say. D, yeah. I mean, most of our learners, we wouldn't teach this to them because it is considered uneducated. But these are much more common in spoken English than they are than the standard versions that we teach. We are teaching the way a small minority of highly educated people from the south of England speak. These are far more common in spoken English than the form that we teach. But no, I wouldn't teach it. I don't know if I'd correct it. There are exceptions. I was in Sweden this summer, and I met a young man who teaches English, who has fabulous English, as people from Sweden very often have, who was working with the Somali community in Stockholm. And most of the people he was working with were learning English because they want to come to Britain. And in particular, they want to come to Britain and they want to work with Arriva, which is a bus company in London, and I think in other cities. And there's some kind of contact. And so these Somali people living in Stockholm are going to come to Britain. If they can, their English is good enough, they'll come to Britain, they'll take the test to become bus drivers in Britain. They need to learn this. It is not appropriate for them to learn what we're teaching in TEFL course books. And I take the point in IEH schools abroad, on the whole, our students are learning English and they want to interact with educated people for whom this would be, and if they spoke like this, it would be regarded as going not in their favour. But there are groups of people for whom these are the models that they need. I work in a school of 4,000 students where half of the people who work in the school are British and the other half are Portuguese. And they're all doing jobs like cleaning or serving in the canteen. Our Portuguese staff, of whom there are several hundred, they talk like this and they need to talk like this. If they don't talk like this, they will be regarded as pretentious, as I sometimes am. Common use among young people, standard English of the future. You left your wallet in it. Or when I started teaching, I used to correct people for talking like this, and then and then I noticed that my colleagues talked like that, and then I think it was, I'd been in the school for about 6 months, and I went to Moscow to give a talk, and I said to my kids, and I'm not going to be here tomorrow. Why are you not going to be here? I'm going to Moscow in it. And they all went, ugh! And I found myself using it. Right is also used. It was interesting. First edition of my book, I left question tags out. I left them out because I just thought, people do use question tags, but they're just so much hassle. Why do we bother to teach them? I'm going to not put them in and see if anybody says anything. International House London, we had a lovely meeting where people gave feedback. It was in International House London that a dear colleague of mine who is still there said, we need question tags. So I put question tags in the second edition, and in it and right, and a note about how it's changing. 8 is an interesting one. No, but I discovered, and then I checked in the corpus, nobody under 30 uses reported speech, ever. And when they write, they don't do it. People don't report speech. They report speech by saying, she was like, what's your problem? It looks like direct speech. It's not direct speech. It's not. Nobody said, what's your problem? They said something different. But the use of like and then an example is how young people report and presume. How many of you say things like that? When I was putting this together, I did it in Word, and Word has spell check, and it comes up with problems. It gives you green squiggly lines for grammar that you ignore because they're always wrong, and it gives you red squiggly lines. But anyway, these were green squiggly lines, of course, and I just thought it was interesting what spell check picked out as being wrong. So where I've written SC, spell check, Word, Bill Gates, didn't like the grammar. So those are the ones that Bill Gates doesn't like, which means all the others are something different. Those are the ones which are okay. Right, I'm coming to the end, and I'm going to kind of recap and then talk talk. I do think there's something quaint and old-fashioned about the English that we are teaching. I take on board the ELF arguments, but even as British English, we need to wake up, and we have a fabulous resource at our disposal, which is good corpora, in order to find out how language is used. What it doesn't do, at least as far as I know it doesn't tell us the age of the people. But it does. It does, yeah, because that's what we need to know. I mean, yeah, those of us with grey hair, if we're teaching people who are 17 or 20 or 25, the language that they're going to be using is not the language we speak, and we need to kind of wake ourselves up. We need to be aware of how language is changing. We need to be aware of the variety. We need to make choices on what to teach on the basis of the needs and the appropriateness for our learners, obviously. We in particular, I wanted them to talk about this yesterday more than they did. We need to make the distinction between the models that we give and then our policy when people say things. So a lot of this I wouldn't teach, I wouldn't use them as models ever, but I have become much more flexible in terms of what I accept from my learners, and I don't kind of force them to say things which are said by a minority of native speakers. I want to finish with two anecdotes, both of which are true. The first is the traumatizing experience when I was trained as a teacher. It was, I did a Delta course, I said, and we had teaching practice and we were observed teaching, and I produced a wacko lesson. It was situational teaching, which I wish we could still do. And I was teaching the third conditional, and I had a fabulous situation about somebody who had lost her passport, and she'd lost her passport. You could talk about being drunk in those days. She got drunk, she'd lost her passport. Oh, she'd had a row with somebody, she'd got drunk, she'd lost her passport, all these things. And then when she got home, it would have been her husband in those days, but now we're much more aware of these things, and it would be her friend or whatever, made various accusations that, oh, why did you do this, why did you do that? And then I drilled my, what would they call, marker sentences, fabulous things. If I'd have been there, I'd have helped. If I hadn't have got drunk, I wouldn't have lost my passport. If I hadn't have lost my passport, I wouldn't have burst into tears. If I hadn't have burst into tears, that man wouldn't have come over and come. And I taught all of these, and I drilled them, and then I had an activity where they proved it. It was a fabulous lesson, brilliant. Sat down at the end of the lesson, and my teacher trainer said to me, "Oh, it wasn't very good, was it? You taught them bad grammar." And I kind of thought to myself, I got a degree in English from a very good university. But I kind of, and she said, well, no, that's not English. You taught, if you hadn't have got drunk, it's not you hadn't have, it's if you hadn't got drunk. And I'd taught the class something, and I felt so stupid. I mean, really stupid. But I taught it because that's what I say. I became so fascist about this particular thing. As a teacher trainer, I'd have people on teacher training courses who taught what I had taught and got wrong. And I used to kind of sit there thinking, I'm going to humiliate them like I was, only I didn't, because I'm a nicer person than my teacher trainer was. She humiliated me. I felt humiliated. I felt stupid. And I think she quite enjoyed making me feel that. And for many, many years, I just felt I was wrong. I hadn't taught, and I'd done something stupid. I hadn't taught something that wasn't in, I had taught something that wasn't in the course books. Stupid. But I wasn't wrong. You go to the corpus and you can check it out. Okay, it's not the most common form, but something like, in spoken English, something like 30% of examples use that form, the form I'd used. In written English, it occurs too. I had a variation, a social variation. Okay. It took me that amount of time to kind of realize you don't have to believe in these fairly arbitrary rules sometimes that have decided that for the purpose of teaching it's one thing or another. We need to follow those rules if it's in the course book. We don't want to confuse our learners, but we need to be aware of the variety. There was a poem up there earlier. Did anybody notice it? Anybody recognise it? It's a poem by John Donne. John Donne lived exactly 400 years ago. I'm teaching John Donne for A-level. Now, John Donne, as we know, was a rake. He kind of like whoring and drinking and sex and wrote poems about them. At the end of his life, he became religious, and he became tormented with worry that his previous life of debauchery would prevent him from being saved. And many of his later poems are like prayers. So, wilt thou is God, wilt thou forgive that sin where I begun, which was my sin, though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive that sin through which I run, and do run still, though still I do deplore? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. And of course, it's a play on his own name. He's John Donne. So all the dones in the poem have two meanings. It's both a past participle and it's for thou hast not done is you have not me. Let's look at the rhymes. Wilt thou forgive that sin where I... Oh, but no, that's past participle. You can't have that. It's got to be began. Simple past. Yeah? And then if we go on, wilt thou forgive that sin where I began, which was my sin though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive that sin through which I ran? Because obviously this is not the present, because the line goes on, and do run still. So it's a past tense. It's not only John Donne. You look through poetry and you learn a huge amount about, you read literature from the past, you learn all kinds of interesting things. I was teaching this and I suddenly realised begun and run are past tenses for John Donne. And it occurred to me that the tyranny of TEFLspeak, which is a kind of joke title, but if John Donne had done his self-training and had gone into teaching, he would have written poems which didn't rhyme. I rest my case. Thank you very much.